Hey guys, how's it going? Figure we do a little short stream today. We are been working on trying to switch over from Twitch Studio to OBS, so figured this was a good time as any to sort of test that out before tomorrow's normal stream. So I figured now's the time. Here we are. Let's do that. So today, we kind of want to do two different things. First, we want to do, going to go over sort of my stream recap from Steam and sort of my video game feelings about this year. And then talk a little bit about some D&D stuff, particularly Session Zero notes and sort of my experience with doing Session Zeros and how to sort of, at least from my perspective, to do them well and sort of figure out how to get to a place where everybody's interested and everybody feels fulfilled sort of by the game you run. So let's go ahead and jump into the Steam recap, shall we? Cut some things together so we can take a look at that. And so again, new to OBS, so things might take a little bit longer. Try to get things done than usual. So for instance, I gotta do this, and then I do a little of this. There we go. Alright, perfect. So one of the things I need to do is I need to bring this up. Sorry, it's a little bit weird. I'm not used to doing the full sort of like multi-view kind of thing, so it's taking me a little extra time. Let's square things up. So yeah, I took a look. Obviously, the Steam reviews came out for most people today, yesterday, whatever. Kind of taking a look at that and looking at the games I played. Realized that I played significantly fewer games this year and got fewer achievements and all that sort of stuff. But I thought I'd take a look at what I did actually play this year. We can kind of go over that and my feelings about all those things. It's kind of a multi-stream, if you want to. So video games and D&D. It's the best of both worlds. Alright, so let's bring up the first bit here. Yeah, so it's pretty clear stance as to where I did this year as far as Steam games are concerned. I played 22 games in general. 18 new games, so mostly new games. That's not surprising. And got 189 achievements. 18 rare achievements, which is actually significantly less than I got last year. Actually, let me bring up the calculator real quick. I had like 400. I'm trying to remember now. 400 and something. 480 to be safe. I had a bunch last year. I had about 2.5, 2.6 times more achievements last year because I played a lot more games last year. I played games much longer this year, but fewer games overall. Mostly controller support. That's nothing too crazy. I, in general, prefer to play with a controller now. I have a nice little rollerball mouse, which is great for normal work and, decompressing on the wrist, but not particularly very good at doing sort of like quick motion FPS stuff. So any sort of shooters and things like that, and things that require sort of like minute controls, I pretty much defaulted to controllers, and then I played a number of games that were very controller oriented, so I went with the controller scheme. And right there at the bottom we have basically my top 3 games that I played throughout most of the year. The vast majority of my playtime. So, of course, the first one is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which technically came out last year, I think. Maybe even the year before. I'm definitely a member of the wait for it sort of gamers. I don't generally buy things when they're new, though despite that, my number 2 was Starfield, which definitely came out this year, and I definitely bought it this year, later in the year. My feelings about Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I feel like it fixed things that I didn't particularly like about Origins and Odyssey, but in its own way created more issues. Different issues. Sort of fixed bugs, created bugs kind of thing. So one of the primary problems that I had with I feel like Origins is there wasn't enough difference in the sort of terrain. Right, it was mostly, I mean, you're playing in Egypt, it's mostly sand for the most part with some, if, as far, once you get away from the rivers and the cities, it's basically all sand and craggy rock. So, and that wasn't particularly interesting to me. That's something they fixed in Odyssey. There was a lot of different sort of biomes to kind of go through a bit more. The problem I have with Odyssey is that you spent a lot of time on the ship, right? Kind of going back and forth and sailing across things and exploring all the regions and all that stuff. And both of those things were kind of solved in Valhalla by having different zones that you go to, as well as sort of bringing in that aspect of spending most of your time when you are on the ship on rivers as opposed to on the coast. But I found that I spent most of my time sort of riding a horse, which was good. I actually enjoyed riding the horse most of the time. Very similar to Red Dead Redemption, which we'll talk about soon. But I've also felt that most of the opening areas were relatively empty. So it was a lot of different terrain and kind of going through, but it was also felt very much sort of going through the motions, traveling over land to find things. Because I felt like the collectibles didn't really add a whole lot to the overall, besides giving you like some skill points, right? That's sort of the main point of doing all that little extra collectible stuff. So now we have Mirage that's come out. I haven't played it yet, obviously, but I'm interested to see what happens with it. We're going back to sort of the original scope, sort of like back to form for Assassin's Creed, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. I like I like plenty of the early Assassin's Creeds, for sure. But I'm not sure that the audience that AC has garnered over the past, 8 years? Whatever that is now? 8 years? Really, 7, 8 years kind of fits by going back to that old sort of pedigree. That sort of AC 1, 2, Brotherhood? Not really even 3 at that point. I mean, I guess 3 a little bit. But basically everything before Black Flag, right? So I'm not sure how that's going to work out in the long term. I mean, that did lead to the point they got to the stagnation to the point that we got this entirely new precursor series. And we know that they're not going to go into the future, right? That's the whole point. Clear about not moving further into sort of gunpowder area, modern firearms era, because for a lot of obvious gameplay reasons, that makes being an assassin very difficult. So it's going to be really interesting to see sort of where they go with it from here at this point. And my second most played game of the year was Starfield. New game. The new Bethesda IP came out this year. It's a whole new thing. But, you know, unfortunately, at least for me, my perspective and talking to some other people, it really did boil down a lot to sort of Fallout in space, and not the best of ways, unfortunately. Kind of talking with some other people, talking with a few friends that had played it, and then looking at some of the reviews online, I think I kind of agree with the general, or at least what I came across as the general consensus being that it is an ocean that is about an inch deep. So, right, there's a lot of stuff you can do in it, but not a lot to the game in itself. And it's clear from the design and sort of the end game and the way that the skill tree works that they had this idea that you were supposed to, kind of like their previous games like Fallout 4, Fallout 3, and most especially Skyrim, this idea that you're going to replay the game again and again and again and again, so that way you can sort of like go down these different rabbit trails and kind of figure out what's going on with each different one. But my experience with that was that I found that I got really invested in the faction quests, which are not particularly long. You know, each faction quest can probably be knocked out in, I don't know, anywhere from 3 to 10 hours, not particularly long. And sort of doing that, and then going back to the main quest and finding the main quest to just be so inane, just so boring, unfortunately. I don't care at all about Constellation. I don't care about the NPCs in Constellation. I don't care about the not aliens. I don't care about anything that's going on with that. I don't care about the artifacts. I don't care about space wizard powers. I think that all that kind of hampers the game in the long run, unfortunately. I wish that wasn't the case, right? I think the game would have been better if we didn't include the space wizard powers. But that's my own take. You know, it's one of the things that I felt, it's certainly the game in 2023 I felt the most let down by. The game that I played that I had high hopes for, and that game did not match that in any way, really. The NPCs are, from my perspective, not very good. Even the quest lines are kind of questionable. I didn't really particularly enjoy the Pirates quest line. I think the quest line that I liked the most was probably the Freestar Rangers, and that's not even a particularly great quest line. I think most of the things that I really enjoyed in it were those sort of like random encounters that you came across, right? The extended warranty things, the rogue AI things, those things were really interesting to me. The finding the colony ship, coming across those things were really interesting. And those sort of like bite-sized narratives were really interesting. But laying that across a background, a template, sort of like a base layer that wasn't very interesting, didn't really hold my attention, didn't really want to make me go back to the lodge or talk to any of the NPCs, or even have any of them in my crew if I could avoid them. You know, just kind of disappointing. And Starfield is definitely a game that I didn't even... I know the ending of it, right? I know the ending of it, but once I had done all the faction quests and was basically forced to focus on the main quest, my interest in the game just fell off a cliff. I didn't care anymore. I didn't like any of those NPCs. I didn't care about the quest lines. I already knew what was going to happen because it's been spoiled a billion times by then. I didn't really want to go get more space wizard powers because none of them were as powerful as casting gun. It's kind of an unfortunate thing for a brand new IP with all this money behind it and all this stuff. And not to get me started on the amount of load times in Starfield. Like, how is it 2023 and we have cities that have zones in them? There's not enough in any of those zones in Starfield, in any of the cities, to make it worthwhile to have them be separate zones. There's not enough NPCs, there's not enough space, there's not enough going on. And so that was really disappointing because it really ends up a lot of the time as you're playing loading screen hopscotch. At least that was my experience. I was playing a lot of loading screen hopscotch where I was like, alright, get in the spaceship. Load time to get into the captain's seat. Get into the map, choose a thing. Loading time to take off. Then another loading screen to get there. Then a loading screen to land. Then a loading screen to get out of the captain's seat. Then a loading screen to get out of the ship. Right? And then to get wherever you want to go, then another loading screen to get into that area. It's just... in 2023, I don't think you can really get away with that. So I'm very disappointed in that game, as I think a lot of people are. And RDR2. Good game. I mean, there's not much to say about it. I wish they had spent less time on horse poop physics and a little bit more on some other weird things that they skipped over, like windmills that don't do anything. That was a little weird oversight. But we had to make sure that, like, the horse balls shrink when it's cold. I don't know. It's very weird. A lot of the hunting and fishing stuff was less than optimal. Right? Could have been optimized a little bit more. I enjoyed the story. It is a little difficult to play a story. I mean, I guess that's a spoiler at this point. So, you know, if you're not interested in it, and spoilers for RDR2, you know, hit mute and then I'll wave my arms like crazy. You can come back, alright? So it's really difficult, I felt like, to play a game, and a lot of video games are very sort of power fantasy-esque. And so to play a game like that where your main character gets sick and becomes more difficult to control was really difficult. It really kind of pulled me out of things. Because I had spent all this time sort of like upgrading guns and doing all this stuff and getting better gear and all that good stuff. Like putting in the, you know, perks sort of stuff and, you know, completing challenges and things like that. Just to have my character sort of towards, as we got closer and closer towards the end, get worse and worse and worse at doing normal gameplay. Which kind of took me out of it. Here. Alright, we're back. So, with that in mind, I think the other sort of big thing that kind of stuck out, I enjoyed the game. I wish that we had gotten the Blackwater stuff as an actual prologue instead of the prologue that we got with John, with Marston. I wish the prologue, like the sort of tutorial prologue, had actually been what happened in... Right, it's called Blackwater, right? Blackwater is the name of the city? I think so. I wish we'd gotten that as Blackwater. Other things about RDR2. I didn't really play any of the online stuff. That's really not my jam. We'll talk about that more as we go through the games. But that's not really my particular interest. I don't play a lot of online multiplayer gameplay. And I think that RDR2 online and particularly GTA 5 online have been detrimental to Rockstar's ability to put out games, because I think they're like, look, we're making so much money off of things like GTA 5 Online, which may or may not be involved with a bunch of money laundering. It seems like it. I'm not really sure, but the idea that, you know, you're sort of tied in with this, and that sort of supporting that online play keeps them from actually going after, you know, putting out GTA 6. Because, I mean, GTA 6 at this point is... Ooh. I mean, it's finally sort of announced. But, you know, it's been how many years now since GTA 5 came out? RDR2, I wish we hadn't done in RDR2 what we had done in RDR1. Right. I wish we didn't follow that path so closely. Right, I wish we had tried to do something else. But with that said, let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of the other games I played this year. So how about we do that? Alright, so we kind of talked about the first three, obviously. We talked about AC Valhalla, we talked about Starfield, we talked about RDR2. So, Need for Speed Unbound. At least in my perspective, a step back from Heat. I know, at least it's been my understanding of people who kind of come into the franchise, that new people that came in with Heat were let down by Unbound, and people who were unhappy, long-term fans of the series who were unhappy with the changes made in Heat were also unhappy with the changes made in Unbound. So Unbound does not seem to be doing very well. It's got a sort of a weird aesthetic to it. The story is frankly kind of stupid. The idea being that it's kind of, for those people who haven't played it, the sort of the premise, the setup for it is that there's this person that's your friend, and then they end up stealing your car and doing dirty by your crew and your garage. And then you kind of come back to it a few years later, and you're all tooled up about it, which is fine. But the fact that the answer to that isn't just re-steal your car seems weird. Or do something else. You're like, no, we have to beat them by racing. And that's, I don't know. That was a really kind of hard pill to swallow. Otherwise, you know, usual Need for Speed kind of issues. You know, there are people that are long-term fans and long-term players that are very good at running away from the cops. They're like, the cops are too easy to shake off. And then there are people that are new to the series and they're like, oh, it's impossible to get the cops off of me. You know, the skill level difference there is interesting. I didn't particularly like the changes to the drift mechanics. I think it made drifting a lot harder. But the converse was that I guess that it made grip racing a lot easier, so if you didn't want to drift, you could grip race. The downside of that is that there are specifically drift events, but there aren't specifically grip events. So it kind of pushes you towards drifting, even though the system itself doesn't really do a lot to support drift racing, which is kind of weird. The yo-yo rubber banding of it Unbound is really, I guess the best way to say it is that it's really obvious. It feels very, in that way, very Mario Kart, right? You're never gonna just like kick people off the line and just, they're always gonna be in your rearview mirror. Doesn't really do that. And then it's got a bunch of yo-yo rubber banding, and then also really punishes you for not driving the way your car is set up, which is very weird. So if you if you have a car that does set up to drift more than grip when you're going through turns, and then you end up doing grip most of the race, you'll actually fall further and further behind in the pack because the game will punish you for that, which is a very weird way to address those issues, to sort of deal with AI in racing. But you don't really know before going into the race, like, how much you might want to drift through corners, how many corners you might want to drift through as opposed to grip through. I mean, you see the outline, so you kind of have a basic idea, but it's also like once you're in the race, you can't really do like a large amount of tuning to your car. So you have to kind of know where you're going with it beforehand. Which means that there are these weird things where it's like, if you set up with a specific type of car to do drifting, and you're like, okay, there's one drift race I want to do, but also I can't go back to the garage to change out cars or to change out my tuning, because if I do, it will end the night or the day. So it kind of leaves you in this weird limbo space. And the cartoon anime effects, particle effects, is just, I don't know, it felt really kind of out of place style-wise. Maybe that's just me. Some people really dislike it, some people are okay with it. So I think it kind of depends on how you feel about it. Mass Effect, The Legacy. Yeah, so I popped in Mass Effect. I played Mass Effect all the way through and played Andromeda 2 all the way through many years ago. So I jumped in and kind of started up Mass Effect 1 again. And in playing it, I realized why maybe I don't want to play Mass Effect 1 again. Mass Effect 1 is definitely, I feel like, the weakest as far as the game mechanics in general. Right. 2 and 3 definitely have better shooting and better sort of structure as far as game mechanics work and how armor and weapons and all that stuff kind of works. So, I mean, I guess the big thing about 1 is that you get the rover, right? That part's fun, but not fun enough to not be as good as the feel of the majority of gameplay of 2 and 3. Yeah, you did about an hour of the first Mass Effect. Yeah, I mean, I got further than that. I got through a few missions in the first Mass Effect playing it again, but I was like, I remembered, so when I first played Mass Effect, I didn't start playing it till all 3 were out. And I got the, like, Collector's Edition 1, 2, and 3. And then I played 1, 2, and 3 back to back to back. There was I even remember now, there was such an upgrade between 1 and 2 in the gameplay area. And I was like, oh yeah, that was that, but that was how many years ago? And then I went back and played it, and I've gone back and played it and been like, no, Mass Effect 1 is real hard to play. So I made it, a bit of ways into it. Did some of the quests, did some different stuff. Went to a few different plans, did a few different storylines, but I was like, at some point, I was like, I'm not really having fun with this, so I'm going to stop playing it. Other games that I sort of played this year, Vampire Survivors, right, that was a big one. Kind of came out towards the end of last year, I think, right? And so I picked it up. It was on sale, not that that means anything. It's a relatively cheap game. And I played it for a while. I enjoyed it for what it is. It's kind of, at least for me, it's a step up from an idle game, right? I found it really hard to play that game without watching or listening to something else, because you're not actively controlling how projectiles and things go out, so you're just basically moving around the screen. So I didn't find that quite engaging enough on its own. But it was really nice if I had like a podcast I want to listen to, or like a long form video essay or something like that. I could do that while also sort of playing the game. So that part was kind of fun. It's really hard to talk bad about Vampire Survivors because I think it's really good at what it sets out to do. And its price point is impeccable. It's not a very expensive game. It feels nice. There's a lot of stuff into it. If you really like that sort of roguelite aspect to it as well, then you're going to get a lot of fun out of it, because there's definitely sort of like, the more you play, the more you unlock, the more you're able to do stuff, and those sorts of things. So that part's really fun. At least for me, the runs, as far as the rogue aspect is concerned, the runs aren't too long. So it's pretty easy to sort of jump in and out of. You know, I think you probably play somewhere between 15 to 45 minutes, I think, for most runs. Or at least that was my experience. Depending on, you know, right, how good you are at not dying. So it was pretty easy to sort of jump in and out of. Every time you were sort of like unlocking stuff, or you at least were sort of banking gold to be able to unlock more stuff. So I felt like I was always making progress in it, even if I didn't unlock something every single run. And again, it doesn't require a ton of attention to it, because you're not dealing with the projectiles, you're literally just moving the joystick most of the time. So it's really easy to do while you've got something else up on a second monitor or whatever. Next game after that, really, I first played this in 2023. I could have sworn I played this in 2022 as well, but that's Pathway. Another roguelite, actually. So it's a... how to describe Pathway? It is a pixel 16-bit tactical RPG roguelite, I guess is the best way to sort of talk about it. So if you imagine something like Final Fantasy Tactics, you're going to be sort of in the right area. Except there's not a job system, but there are sort of like upgrade trees for each character, and there are a finite number of characters, named characters, and you unlock more as you sort of go through the adventure and find them. But it also has this very cool sort of pulp action, Indiana Jones sort of paint that's all over everything. So you're in sort of like Egypt and Algeria kind of areas, you know, North Africa in sort of the 30s, right? Probably the biggest thing that I don't like about Pathway is that you're very clearly fighting Nazis, but they decided for whatever reason, I'm not sure, maybe there's something in sort of like the developer notes, but I didn't see it, a reason why they did not use the swastikas for Nazis. So it's Nazis in everything, including down to the uniforms, down to the colors, down to everything, except for the literal iconography. And I'm not really sure why they didn't include that. But they didn't. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, it's very much like if you wanted to play Final Fantasy Tactics, but a roguelite, but also Indiana Jones, then you're probably going to like Pathway. I guess the only other downside that I say to playing Pathway is that the runs can take a while, because they're sort of turn-based battles. So I got to a point, and I haven't finished it all the way out, probably about halfway through it, but I got to a point where each run was taking, 1-2 hours plus. And I was like, yeah, that's really hard to sort of schedule sometimes, right? As a working adult, you're like, I can sit down and play this game, but I also can't really stop it in the middle of it. So I don't know if it's going to be 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So that kind of makes it difficult to sort of arrange time around. And let's see, 2023, I rebooted up Skyrim with some mods. It was Skyrim. I mean, I think I got to a point when I was playing Skyrim that I didn't want to play something new. I just wanted something familiar, something cozy kind of play with. And so, similar to how I booted up Mass Effect, so I booted up Skyrim and started playing it again. And it's Skyrim, man. What do you want? I've only made it through Skyrim all the way once, and that's enough, at least for me. It's Skyrim. It's an old game. If you enjoy Skyrim, you enjoy Skyrim. Cosmic Heroine. That was a lot of fun. Cosmic Heroine's very much a 16-bit modern take on classic JRPGs. It's got a sci-fi bend to it. It's got a sci-fi spy bend to it, is what I should say. It's fun. I think it gets a little too into its own abilities for characters once you get about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through. There's a little bit, like, if you're one of the people that really, really wants to sort of do things like optimize combos and things like that, I think there's some meat there to sink your teeth into. I wasn't particularly interested in that by the time it came kind of up, which was about, like I said, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through. I felt like I had already had my sort of standard operating procedures down for going through fights. Then got sort of like this dearth of like new abilities kind of flooding in. And I was like, I don't really need new abilities. My abilities that I have work pretty well. So if you're interested in sort of like tinkering and trying to do like optimal combos and things like that with sort of JRPGs, turn-based RPGs, then Cosmic Heroine is maybe something to look at. Otherwise, it's enjoyable. It's not too long. It's not too complex. It's pretty easy to pick up and play. I'll give you a good few hours of gameplay. GTA 5. Yeah, I picked up GTA 5 again. So, GTA 5 felt very similar to sort of Mass Effect. So you can definitely see that sort of Mass Effect, GTA 5, and Skyrim kind of all fell in the same place where I wasn't interested in really trying anything new. I was going to grab things that I already knew and sort of pull back into them, or games that I had tried out and maybe bounced off of. So GTA 5 is a game I played all the way through, and so I jumped into it again. It very quickly reminded me why I don't like the characters, I don't like the story. I remember, and it brought me back to my first playthrough, and there's a point where I just kind of like went off the deep end, where I was like, I cannot take this game, this narrative that's trying to be serious anymore. And it's towards the end. I mean, that's a bit hyperbole. Like, I already wasn't taking it serious. But then I got to a point where I felt like the game wasn't taking itself seriously anymore. And it's a conversation between Franklin and Lamar towards the end, where they just have a very silly conversation. I was just like, I cannot. And it's supposed to, that's the thing, is that it's supposed to be extremely, like, impactful in the game. And it just sort of brought me out of it. The conversation felt so not how two people would talk to each other. And it really just sort of pulled me out. And I already talked a little bit about, I think, the Grand Theft Auto problem with Rockstar and GTA Online, RDR2 Online, which I think they're going to continue to do that with their games, because it tends to be very successful. So they're not going to keep putting out new games until they feel like they are no longer making the amount of money they want to make from the online modes. And I think one of the problems that I have with GTA 5 is that GTA 5 has a very huge map. It has a big map, right? You're driving around cars, but it falls into that sort of like open world problem, that modern open world problem, where the world is so huge and there's nothing to do in the world. What is it, like 99% of the buildings in GTA 5 you can't even walk inside. There's nothing to really do with the pedestrians or the cars, and there are a lot of missions where it's just like drive to the other side of the map to go start a mission. Okay, but the driving controls aren't particularly good, and because the traversal mechanics and there's nothing to explore, that the open world is wasted a lot, at least in my opinion, is wasted a lot. Like, I found myself really bored in GTA 5 driving to places, because there was not a lot to do. There weren't, which is something that they changed in RDR2, right? You have those sort of radiant events that sort of happen, and sure, yeah, I mean, they repeat, but you go through, 10 or 20 of them, and you've seen them all. But assuming that in RDR2, you're also fast traveling, which you should be doing most of the time, which is not something you can do in GTA 5, I don't think. I don't think there is any fast travel. I guess to safe houses, right? You can fast travel to safe houses. That still leaves a lot of room for driving. So, I mean, there was a lot of driving, but not a lot to do during those drives. And the next game I played was Crying Suns. I really enjoyed Crying Suns, actually. It's got a very sort of Blade Runner Dune sci-fi kind of bend to it. It is a roguelite. It is sort of like FTL. So it's got a lot of FTL. It's kind of built off of FTL's bones, I'd say that. So you're in a spaceship and you go places and do things. You're trying to travel across sort of like a map, just like an FTL. I think the big difference is in FTL, most of the time when you're doing fighting on your ship or somebody else's ship. Where in Crying Suns, you have this full sort of like top-down RTS space fight map where you have your ship that sends out fighters and drones and things like that. So it's a lot of fun. And it's got that sort of rock, paper, scissors gameplay where you have drones and fighters and frigates, I think. It's the other type of sort of minor ship. It's a lot of fun. You get to choose your different sort of officers, and each one of them gives you a boon to do things. You do these things like land on a planet to try to get resources and try to not get your like space marines killed and things like that. So it's a very interesting game. I really enjoyed it. I had the same problem with Crying Suns that I had with Pathway, is that you get to a point as you get further and further into the game that each run takes longer and longer and longer to do. Which is not necessarily something that I'm looking for in most rogues and roguelites. Is that I don't really want a variable length of play. Like the difference between a bad run being, 15 minutes and a good run being 3.5 hours. I think one of the strengths of things like rogues and roguelites, that they're like snack food games, right? You can like pick them up, do a run, put it down, go do something else, kind of come back in. Very Slay the Spire kind of style. And it's like, yeah, if you fall anywhere in that 15 minutes to an hour, that's a little easier. But when it's like 15 minutes to 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours, you're like, it's really hard to sort of judge when you can start a run and when you can't. But otherwise, I really can't give it enough praise, other than, I think the only other thing I'd say about the game is that its plot is a little derivative. I know. I mean, it's a video game. So it kind of pulls from greater sci-fi works in different media, TV, movies, and novels. Which doesn't mean that it's not good in its own right, it's just that it wears its influences on its sleeve, let's put it that way. And it's not gonna surprise you really with its narrative. Not that it's bad, it's just not gonna surprise you. It's not gonna take you in any sort of new and interesting direction. Destiny 2. Yeah, played a little bit. Running the same problem that I do with any other sort of MMO online game. It's just that they're not for me. I really struggle to stay engaged with them. I don't find their gameplay loop particularly interesting. Not much to really say about it. I think the game's fine. I think the shooting's fine. I just didn't really care about why I was shooting, why I was going to X to shoot Y, if that makes sense. I know there are a lot of people that really, really enjoy them, and I'm glad you guys really, really enjoy them. They're just not for me, man. And this kind of reminds me of like this goes all the way back to me like trying out WoW for the first time. WoW, I played for about 5 hours. And within 5 hours, I was like, yeah, I don't really care about this game. It just didn't do anything for me. Very similar to sort of like the GTA 5 problem. So I didn't care about the characters, I didn't care about the story, I didn't care about the world, what was going on in it. I know that lots of people do. I know that lots of people really love that sort of gameplay, loot and shoot gameplay. And I do. I like Borderlands and things I like that loot and shoot. Even Borderlands have some semblance of a story that you feel like you're a part of, and that's sort of the weakness of the MMO, is that nobody can really be the main character because everybody kind of has to be the main character. So it can't really fall onto one person being the hero. Fury Unleashed. Fury Unleashed was a very interesting game. It was another rogue-like light sort of situation. If you ever wanted to play sort of Metal Slug as a roguelike or roguelite, Fury Unleashed is maybe the game for you. It was fun. I really enjoyed it. The thing that kind of stopped me from playing it, because I definitely didn't beat it, is that unlike when I talked about Vampire Survivors, where I felt like I was always sort of making progress with it, I definitely felt like I hit a wall within Fury Unleashed where I was no longer making forward progress. And I was having to sort of like redo the same run again and again and again to sort of like pick up the crumbs to try to get moving forward to something new that I hadn't already played. So yeah, I mean that was sort of my big problem with Fury Unleashed. But the gameplay mechanic and everything, the mechanics of everything in Fury Unleashed, I quite enjoyed. So if you're interested in that sort of like side-scrolling platform, Metal Slug, but then have a little extra sprinkling of sort of like a roguelite on top of it, give it a look. It's a pretty interesting game. And after that is Just Cause 4. What can I really say about Just Cause 4 that hasn't already been said about Just Cause 4? In many different arenas. The gameplay's not very good, the controls aren't very good. It's like playing Just Cause 3, yet somehow worse, which is very interesting. I didn't play it very long. I think I put maybe like 8 or 9 hours into it, and then I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'd rather just go play Just Cause 3 again. That has better controls and better everything. I feel like enough people have sort of shredded Just Cause 4 enough in reviews across the internet that I don't really need to say more about that. It'll Do. So It'll Do is a game that I've had for a very long time, but I had not played. I, in fact, played the spin-off game, Card City Nights, before I played it. So if you are interested in sort of a triple triad card game, then I'd say check out Card City Night. I think there's a Card City Nights 2. I haven't played it. But It'll Do is sort of the original game. And of course, there's a play on words in that name. And this game sort of falls into the space between Zelda games. I think it falls between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. Maybe older than that. Certainly came out before Breath of the Wild. But it is very much a top-down Zelda spatial puzzle clone. Combat not particularly important in it. There are boss fights, there are enemies to interact with, sometimes to battle directly, other times to use as solutions for puzzles, but it definitely has sort of that, you get a new tool, you have new ways to mess with the environment, you can go back to old spots and mess with puzzles, be able to work your way through and unlock new secrets and new level up power-ups and things like that. I really enjoy the art style. It's very fun. It also has one of those games that has a female protagonist. Before that was cool, which is also neat. It's a fun game. So if you have 10 hours or so to kill and you're looking for Zelda puzzle game kind of thing, that sort of spatial puzzle, moving, sliding blocks and things like that, then you'll probably enjoy It'll Do. I'd say go check it out. The Pillars of Eternity. What do I want to say about the Pillars of Eternity? I did not play a ton of Pillars of Eternity. There was a game that I was really excited for a very long time, and then had it in my library for a long time, and then finally got around to playing it, and found out that even by adventure game standards, it is an incredibly slow game. It is, first and foremost, an adventure game. So it's a lot of walking to places, talking to people, picking up items, going to another place, combining with another item to another to do a thing, to then go to another place to talk to another person. So if that sounds boring, it is. Also, the walking part takes way too long in this game. There are way too many places. Like, I remember going through, having to talk to a person in a room, go to another room, go to the next adjoining room, so that way I could leave the building, go across the courtyard, into another building, go through another room to talk to another NPC, to then go all the way back to talk to that first NPC. That was way too long to do a very simple task. The game's about basically building cathedrals in medieval Europe. So if you're interested in how cathedrals were built in medieval Europe and all that stuff that kind of goes into things, church, and how people within the church work with each other and work with laymen and what that dynamic's sort of like, if you're interested in that, as I was, I'd say read the book, don't play the game. You're really going to get a lot more out of it by doing that. And the game after that I played was Rustler. So the best way to describe Rustler is a GTA 2 clone. So sort of that top-down aspect, and then set it in medieval times. So you're a horse rustler, right, instead of a Grand Theft Auto. But very similar. It kind of strides that line between GTA 2 and something like Rockstar's other game, bully. So you're kind of a ne'er-do-well that beats people up and shakes people down for money and steals things and moves things around and kills people, and very similar especially old Grand Theft Auto sort of gameplay. The thing that had me sort of bounce off of it was the controls, especially the horse controls, which were really, really difficult to deal with. That top-down is not as... The control twin stick, especially the twin stick aspect of it for shooting things like crossbows, were not as intuitive as something like Hawaii Shakedown, which is something I played last year and really, really liked. In itself is sort of a GTA 1/2 top-down clone, and I felt like that game had a much better sort of control scheme for that than Rustler ended up having. But it has a very similar, very sort of almost infantile, crude humor to it. So if you enjoy that sort of stuff, maybe Rustler's going to be right for you. If you can get over the sort of the controls, that'll be a lot of fun for you. After that, I played Pathfinder Adventures. I tried to replay Pathfinder Adventures. So, sort of like I talked about earlier, there's some games that I played and then put down, and I'm like, but I might come back to them later. I got frustrated with them now, but maybe sometime in the future, I'll come back to them and play them. Well, I tried to do that again with Pathfinder Adventures. It didn't work out. I really don't like the way the game is set up mechanically. I gave it my due diligence. I gave it my good old college try, and I just couldn't. I just don't find it fun or entertaining or interesting. And a lot of times even challenging. It just feels like you're so hamstrung by RNG and whatever the cards are that you have in your hand, in your deck. And so if you don't have good cards in your deck, or you don't have the right cards in your deck, and they're not shuffled in the right way, then you just kind of can't win, which is not great. It's also a game that punishes you for having too many characters in your party, but also punishes you for not having enough characters in your party, but also doesn't give you any indication about what is the right amount of characters to have in your party, or the right amount of what type of items you should bring with you. I don't know. A lot about it is I felt there was like a wall between me playing the game and how the game wanted me, and I couldn't get over it because there was no communication for the game as to how I should play it. After that was Space Marine, technically the 10th anniversary of it. And I didn't play it till this year. Actually, I didn't play it until this month, I think. Honestly, I played it just a few weeks ago. Played it for a little while, enjoyed the beginning of it, then started to have problems with it. Then I started, like I do usually when I have a game where I start feeling like I'm having problems with the game, I'll start to look at reviews and what other people are sort of said about the game to see if, like, am I missing something? Am I doing something wrong? Like, why is it that I can't seem to get this game to work the right way? Or I'm not really clicking with it. And then found out that no, the exact issues I was having with the game are the exact issues a lot of other people have with the game. Which is that you play a Space Marine who controls like a tank, but a tank made of tissue paper, because you can take like 2 bullets in your power armor before you die. In a game that's primarily focused on sending hordes and hordes of enemies at you with weapons that feel like pea shooters that don't do a lot of damage, and even just very basic enemies can easily take 2-3 plus hits to kill, and then you can only take as many hits. I found that unless there were situations I got into where it's like, unless I was really lucky, I would just die and then I'd have to replay it. And the worst thing is like there weren't skippable cutscenes for some of that stuff, so I would have to redo the same thing over and over again from the beginning of whatever this combat area scene was, and go through the whole rigmarole to get back to the place where I was, where I died just to die again very quickly. And so I ended up bouncing off of it. But the new bolt gun is out as far as Warhammer 40k is concerned, IP stuff, and people seem to like that. I'm not a huge Doom and Doom clone person, but if you are, bolt gun's supposed to be quite good. So if you're interested in that, I'd say go check that out instead. Thea of the Awakening. I thought that I had played Thea of the Awakening before this year, and maybe I did, because this is sort of like an expanded version of Thea of the Awakening. But regardless, I played it. It's kind of weird. It's a mash between something like The Settlers, which is a German game if you've never played it, which is sort of like a very sort of small-scale city builder, combined with something like The Sims, where you can have sort of like, or even something like RimWorld, where you have sort of like finite control over a specific NPC. And then it's got a very sort of like medieval fantasy, gods and monsters kind of backing onto it. You know what? Instead of the thing I might be confusing it with is it Endless Fantasy? It's from the same people that brought out Endless Dungeon. Endless Legend, that's the name of the game. I think that's what I was going to get confused with. It's somewhat similar, and Endless Legend is sort of like if you took Civilization and slammed it together with sort of like Might and Magic. It was okay. It's just based on, it's one of those things where you buy a game because you like the trailer, and then you start playing the game and realize it's not necessarily the game that you want it to be. And I don't really know. I think I wanted more of the sort of minutia RPG elements of it, and less of the sort of city builder, city management part of it, and I think it had a lot more of the sort of the city management, resource management part of it, sort of like a more like Banished, and I enjoy Banished. It's just that's not what I was really looking for out of this game, and so there was just sort of like a disconnect there. I don't think it's a bad game, quite good actually. I really enjoy the art. I like the sort of like emergent storytelling that happens with it. It just wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. And yeah, I finally got around to playing Sword and Sorcery. I mean, that's an old game. It's fun. I mean, it's a point-and-click adventure game. And the last one that's on this list is Plebby Quest. Ooh, Plebby Quest is a game that I felt like a game that I bounced off of, and maybe I'll go back and play again. It's very similar to Crusader Kings. So if you imagine Crusader Kings with sort of a different art style, it's pretty similar. It's got this very sort of cutesy, like, finger puppet kind of character design to it. I think what really held me back from Plebby Quest, the same thing that held me back from Crusader Kings and other Paradox titles, is they're not very good about... They don't have very good tutorials, frankly. That's always been an issue with the Paradox games, and I felt like it was an issue with Plebby Quest, is that it kind of dropped me in. Basically, somebody took you and like sat you in the pilot seat of like a 747, and then there's just dials everywhere, and you're like, I have no idea what any of these things do, and all you said was that if you pull the stick up, it go up. So that sort of situation. So I think Plebby Quest is something that I might come back to later on, and maybe spend a little bit more time. Later on, there'll be a little bit more sort of like in-depth or very clear, concise guides as to maybe even a reworked tutorial. I don't know if they're still working on it. Because that's definitely the sort of thing that's held me back from Europa Universalis and Crusader Kings and most Paradox titles. At least their grand strategy titles, is that, and they're well known for not having very good tutorials. And that sort of thing, so it's sort of like a barrier to entry. And so I'd be interested to trying it out, but I think I gotta let that one cool off a little bit. But yeah, I mean, those are all the games that we played in, or at least that I played in 2023. Certainly fewer games with some of my friends earlier this week, kind of looking at, and then went back and looked at what I did in 2022. So I definitely played fewer games, way fewer achievements, and I spent less time per game. And I think that's reflected here. I spent 34% of my playtime, so a third of my playtime this year went to Assassin's Creed, which I played like 210 hours, something like that, in Assassin's Creed, so I definitely played fewer hours of games this year. Which makes sense. I didn't buy a ton of games this year. I think these 3 games are the 3 games I bought this year. I don't think I bought any other games this year, so that makes sense. Well, no, I bought Need for Speed Unbound, but the rest of these games I already had. So yeah, I didn't spend a ton on video games this year, in general. I spent some more mainly on, like, Switch titles, less so on PC titles. Alright, well, that was everything. That's, I think the next thing we're going to do is we're gonna jump in and take a look at, I said we're going to do some Session Zero stuff, talk about that stuff. But I'm going to take a quick break first, and then we'll jump into it. Alright guys, so I will see you guys in just a little bit. Alright guys, bye. Alright, let's go ahead and get back started. So obviously, on this channel, most of the time we deal with D&D and other tabletop RPG stuff. That's what we're going to jump back into now. Now we kind of get over this, I just thought it would be kind of interesting to kind of take a little departure and look at some of the external sources and other stuff that I play outside of just sort of like the tabletop RPG space. My feelings about that, because obviously my feelings about other media are going to inform my feelings about D&D and tabletop RPGs in general. We're going to jump back into it. We're going to start looking at talking about some Session Zero stuff and sort of how I've run Session Zeros and had some success with it, so you guys can get some notes, and maybe it's something you like, maybe it's something you don't like, maybe you have other things that you do instead, or things you'd like to add. If so, share it with me. But before we do that, I figured I should talk about some other things that we kind of have going on. So like I said, we're obviously D&D/TTRPG focused in general, and have a new blog up on reddragontheme.com. We're talking about region hex mapping, so sort of building a full world and bringing scale to that. So if you're interested in that, I'd say go check that out. That's a lot of fun. We did some of that on stream, so that's always fun. Make sure that you follow and subscribe, so that way you can get the notifications when we go live and all that good stuff. Also put up the newest video on YouTube of our solo RPG stream, which we do in general every Thursday, and we'll be doing one, as far as I know, tomorrow. That's our plan anyways. We'll be running out and doing that. We should be picking up with a big dragon fight, so that should be pretty interesting. So make sure to tune back in tomorrow so we can deal with all that. Show you the sheet we're working with. We're talking about sort of bringing up some of my old sort of Session Zero notes, so we can kind of take a look at it. So these are sort of my Session Zero notes. So these are kind of split up into two sections. So first, individual sort of face-to-face time that I try to get with all the players. And then afterwards, either separately or together, sort of building the characters that are going to show up in that campaign. In a lot of instances, and sort of when I see a lot of people talk about Session Zero, they talk about, from the DM perspective, like having a campaign already set in your mind and then sort of regurgitating it out to your players. There's nothing wrong with that. It's absolutely fine. I think that we keep talking about sort of like the Dungeon Master shortage and things like that. So given the climate that we exist in at this time, that if you have a particular game and you're willing to run that game, bully for you. Like, go do it. You will find players. You don't really need to kowtow the players and what they want by any stretch of the imagination, because you are the in-demand resource, right? Scarcity, right? You are valuable. So you shouldn't have to bend over for what players want necessarily. That said, if you're interested in running a game with, friends, rather than randos on the internet, you may want to, make sure that your friends are interested in playing in, because this isn't necessarily just a one and done with some people that you're never going to see again. And so that's sort of what we're looking for in these Session Zero notes. The way that I did this, and we'll see some particular notes about this particular campaign that I ran, I think 2 years ago, and we'll see some particulars and notes that I took from those specific players as to what to sort of like incorporate into the story. But these first parts are very generic and use them multiple times. So the first thing that I want to know, like when I sit down to talk to a new player, and I try to do these individually so people aren't sort of biased and feel like they need to go with the group and aren't afraid to speak their own mind. So I try to talk to everybody individually if I can. First one is, who do you want to drive this campaign? Do you have a particular character vision? Do you have a character that's going to have their own goals, their own motivations, this thing that they're trying to accomplish, and you want the game to help support that fantasy? Or do you want to play a character in a plot that's sort of more overarching, sort of meta-narrative plot? Either one is fine. Just trying to get an idea. And the likelihood is that if you talk to 4 different people, you may not get the same answer. And that's going to give you an idea, like say if you talk to 4 people and 3 of them give you plot railroad, right? They want to do a more plot thing, but one of them has a very strong character that they want to play, has very specific goals that they're trying to achieve through this character, and that's what they see to being fun for the campaign. Well, you know that about every 3 to 4 sessions you need to be doing something for that one character that's sort of like trying to pursue their own goals, while not letting them stray too far from the group and sort of the overall meta-narrative. So you want to weave those things together. But doing this will give you a lot of good ideas about what sort of adventures are going to make sense and what sort of storylines are going to make sense for that overall campaign. Next thing I want to talk to the player about is the sort of wonder as far as the campaign world is concerned. Do they know or can they find out information about everything they encounter in the world? So, like, when you run across a bullet, do you imagine that every character in your party is going to know what a bullet is? Or is this going to be like a full discovery where you're going to be like, you have the same knowledge that somebody historically from anachronistic sort of medieval times in our world would know, being that they've never seen anything like this, they don't know anything about this, they know things like deer and rabbits, boars, and lions, but they don't know anything about something like a bullet that's basically like a land shark. Like, that is beyond the scope of their knowledge. Because I feel like this is not only going to tell you particularly how to address and introduce those aspects, but also can give you an idea about like how characters are supposed to deal with those aspects. Right, a bullet encounter in a world where everybody knows the bullet and knows what it is and has seen Tremors and knows what to do with it. versus characters that have no idea what this thing is, have never seen it before, don't know that it's gonna like burrow through the ground and like try to grab them. Makes two very different encounters. Next thing I want to talk about is genre. So like what tone, what sort of mood, what sort of genre do you want the game to be? And these are just sort of like examples that sometimes I kind of throw out to the players. You want to do a sort of like action, swashbuckling, cool guys don't look at explosions kind of game. You want to do sort of a dark game where everything's awful, there's not really a lot of highlights, everything's sort of it's full of moral quandaries, and you know, there are no good guys, there are just like less bad guys in that way. You want sort of that gritty, realistic sort of bend where it's almost very survivalistic, where things like disease or exposure to the elements, or running out of resources, or getting infections in your wounds are just as serious, if not more serious, than the monsters you face? Do you want to do more sort of intrigue noir, detectives, politics, spies, cloak and dagger kind of stuff? Are you interested in doing a builder and explorer kind of thing? They talk about sort of like a Minecraft, a hex crawl. The wilds are unexplored and you're exploring it for the first time, or you're trying to go to a place and try to set up maybe like a new trade post or do something like that. Like, do you want to focus more on things that you can constructively sort of like build in the world rather than being a person that travels through the world? Other genres include sort of like war. Do you want a backdrop to be sort of like a big war, which can be really interesting? Saving Private Ryan, like you're part of the war, or just a war is something that happens in the background of the story and so sort of impacts it, but not totally, almost in the way that something like the zombies are in something like The Walking Dead, where it's like they're not really the focus of the story most of the time. They're just sort of a backdrop that sort of like ratchets up the tension and the drama of an otherwise very sort of generic post-apocalyptic kind of story. And then do you want to do something that's like weird and horror? Do you want to do like cosmic horror or body horror or weird things? Do you want to have ray guns and spaceships and Cthulhu? And maybe you want something that's like fantasy, but we're also going to like try to slam something else that's weird and different into that fantasy. Maybe time travel, things like that. Next thing I usually ask players about is sort of the level of the civilization that they want to play in. So most D&D and most other sort of D20 clone kind of games are kind of set in that very much European Renaissance medieval time period. But that doesn't mean that it has to be. We could do a very sort of swords and sandals, right? We could do very sort of Bronze Age stuff. We could do full-on Renaissance and have firearms as being a big thing. We could do, you know, steampunk or diesel punk or sci-fi thing. So the level of technology, because there's a big difference between the technology level in something like Eberron and something like Dark Sun. The way magic is used changes. In Eberron, you have flying ships and trains, and in Dark Sun you're like, I can't find metal. Very different sort of thing. I can't find metal or the gods or plants. Very different sort of levels of civilization. There aren't a lot of big cities in Athos because it's really hard to live there. Or you look at something like Eberron and there are a ton of large cities in that setting. And then bouncing off that is the points of light. Like how widespread is civilization? Do you want something that is widespread and it's relatively safe to get between city and city, or do you want cities and other settlements to be lone flame in the dark? Like, hey, if you leave this city to travel to another city, like that's an incredibly dangerous task. Like people don't do that because everything between those 2 points of light is incredibly difficult, right? There are tons of monsters. It's really difficult to get there. The roadways aren't kept up. So kind of get an understanding about sort of like what they're looking for in their game, and then sort of adventure location ranking, which is a very fancy way to say, where do you want sort of most of your adventure to take place? So do you want to take place mainly in sort of villages and cities and civilized farmland around them? You want it to take place in sort of the frontiers, marches the sort of edge of civilization before it goes into the wilds? You want it to be fully on into the wild, do a Lewis and Clark explorer going into weird places that nobody's been before, completely uncharted? Do you want to mainly do dungeon delves? Very different mode of play. Do you want to do sort of like a long trek or voyage, like a Marco Polo kind of thing, where you're going from one place across a large portion of the world to go to another place and then come back? Do you want to do a lot of planes jumping? Is that what you're interested in the game? Do you want to not spend that much time on the prime material plane? You want to do like Spelljammer, Astral Sea stuff? Do you want to, do City of Brass, Sigil, all sorts of things, kind of jumping between different, like, wildly different places. So, and usually I have them rank them. So when I get, like, 4 different players things all together, I can look at them side by side and see where they kind of ranked everything. And kind of know, what adventures people are going to be most okay with and what adventures people definitely don't really want to play. Monster pervasiveness. How monstrous do you want the game to be? And that kind of goes from, like, man is the only monster, and that tends to be weirdly where I fall most of the time. Is I tend to default to very human-centric and humanoid-centric stories and adventures, where I tend to play just as well with in the city between gangs and spies and thieves and all sorts of political stuff, just as much as dealing with goblins and kobolds and gricks and all sorts of weird stuff, or very sort of like Underdark monsters. So the idea is, like, do you want to do mainly with, like, people are the bad guys? Do you want to do, like, fairy tale, like, monsters are sort of the stuff of fairy tales? People maybe know about them, some people know about them, some people don't, where people have certain ideas about monsters, whether they may or may not be true. Very much sort of like how we in popular zeitgeist kind of view things like vampires, where we're like, okay, cross, and I got my garlic, so I should be okay from vampires, and then that may or may not be true if you run across an actual vampire, which in our D&D fantasy world is going to be a very real potential threat. And then you're just like, that's alright guys, I've got garlic. And then the vampire kills you because they don't care about garlic. And then sort of on the tail end is monsters are extremely common. So the idea that being that, like, yeah, I mean, most people know what goblins are. If they haven't seen a goblin themselves, they certainly know what they look like and how they act. When you come across something like, again, going back to that bull example, like, everybody knows what a bull is. Even if they've never seen one before, they're like, oh yeah, that's like the land shark thing. Yeah, I know what that is. So obviously you want to get up on something like bedrock, off the ground, where it can't get to you, sort of thing. And then we go to sort of encounter rankings, which is very similar to sort of like the adventure location rankings. Again, just trying to get a beat on what individual players kind of want from the campaign, what sort of they're more interested within each adventure dealing with. Because there's a big difference between a group that says, wants something, say, like a set piece combat, with a bunch of sort of like big boss fights with like ads and layer actions, a fight that's going to take an hour to an hour and a half to run, to somebody who's really interested in riddles or puzzles, right? Player challenges, which don't really have anything to do with your character's ability. It has to deal with your player and the party's ability to figure out how to solve a very simple puzzle for children. Honestly, it's how that usually goes. Right, but those are 2 very different types of adventures within 2 very different types of campaigns based off of what people kind of vote for. So again, kind of have people rank things, and they don't necessarily have them rank them all out. They may be like, yeah, maybe choose your top 2 and the 2 you're least interested in actually doing. That kind of gives me an idea, and then kind of gives me some middle room to work with. So we talked about sort of set piece combat, which is sort of those big boss fights, layer fights, solo kind of things. Skirmish combat, which are just sort of what I consider just kind of generic normal encounters, usually with, a group of enemies that generally number the same amount as player characters. Whether they're interested in doing sort of investigation detective kind of things, like are they trying to like figure out clues and trying to piece together evidence and follow a trail and do things like that and try to solve mysteries, things like that. Are they interested in exploration, like going to a place and figuring out what it's all about and trying to maybe recover a specific artifact or find some place or a person, etc.? Are they interested in more player challenges, which we already kind of talked about, puzzles, riddles, things of that nature? Are they more interested in sort of negotiation and persuasion? Right, you play with players who are not particularly interested, especially in this sort of new wave, specifically D&D players. They're not necessarily interested in doing a ton of combat. Like, combat's not what brought them to the game. Usually it's watching some sort of like live play that's got a very high amount of sort of like role play and back and forth negotiation, persuasion kind of stuff. And maybe they're more interested in that, so they're often looking for ways to solve problems that don't include sort of pulling a sword and killing people. Are they interested in doing like subterfuge? Do they want to play a Blades in the Dark kind of game where you're doing a heist, or you're doing blackmail, you're cheating people, intimidating them, you're lying to them, you're stealing from them, where generally if you're playing a subterfuge sort of encounters, the fail state is usually getting into combat. Right? That's usually the failure. Then you have to fight or run. And the last one being sort of like the accumulation of power. Like, are they more interested in getting the wealth, the dragon's hoard, than fighting the dragon, or making sure that the dragon's not a threat to the countryside? They're like, yeah, I kind of just want all their gold. Are they interested in getting like really powerful magic items? Are they interested in getting a lot of levels? This will give you a lot of good insight as to how the players want to feel rewarded in the game. Something like negotiation, persuasion, or subterfuge, even puzzles and riddles, like these sorts of things reward players that are really clever, whereas something like combat obviously rewards something more like power gamers and slayers, people that want to jump in and kill things and be very efficient in that way. So there's a lot of talking that's in here, and accumulation of power is like, I just want to get more powerful. The power is sort of power gamer aspect of it. I just want to be better. I want my character to be better than they were before. It doesn't matter how they get there. And then this one I have lethality, question mark, 0 through 100. What is the percentage of lethality that you want in the game? Do you want death to be one bad die roll away? Any encounter, any scene, you make a poor decision, you make a bad die roll, death is an omnipresent thing that's in the world. It really requires you to be careful, to be thoughtful, to be smart, to be curious, but also prepared, and to know when things are like, it's okay to run away, discretion is the better part of valor, like live to fight another day, survival is more important than winning. Or do you want something that's, what I think 5e is very, and most modern D&D is very much more geared towards the idea that lethality is most of the time off the table. Characters only die to those big named bad guys, the big villains, or they make a very dumb mistake, right? They do a keyleth jumping off the cliff, or they get smoked by a big name bad guy. Something that's like their death needs to have some dramatic aspect tied to it. Or they need to be extremely dumb. They need to make an extremely poor choice. And assuming that I'm going to warn them away from that, right? Like you need to be careful here, or even being able to take the step back and be like, your character is smart enough not to do this, because they understand that it means basically certain death if they fail. But understanding where players want that lethality, which can vary a lot, right? Even within the same group, where some characters are like, yeah, I want to ride the razor's edge and I want it to be every day to maybe be my last, and I want my character to live that way and be blood and glory and wealth and all that good stuff, but also like one bad thing and I'm going to lose everything and have to make up a new character. And other people, they're like, you know, I'm more interested in sort of the story and building things up to sort of like a grand climax and a crescendo, and if things go bad and I roll poorly or the bad guy rolls a big crit and it serves the narrative and it makes sense that in this climactic battle then my character is struck down, then I'm fine with that. Right? Understanding whichever end of the spectrum that players are coming at the game will help you dial in how deadly to sort of make those encounters and adventures. Yeah, and I have this one in bold. What's one thing you do and don't want to see in the campaign? That could be some sort of item, a place, an NPC, a monster, a scene, etc. Right? You run into people like, I know there's a player in one of my games that I play with who is arachnophobic. She does not like spiders. If that's the case, then, you know, that's where you say, I don't really want spiders in the game. Or if we're going to have spiders, I don't want, like, miniatures of spiders on the table or whatever. We will swap those out. They can be scorpions, they can be something else. They don't have to be that. They can be poison monkeys. It doesn't really matter. They just don't want to be spiders. That's fine. And then one thing is, these are also the things that are like the must include things. And people are like, oh well, I definitely want to fight a dragon at some point. I'll make sure there's a dragon in one of the adventures coming up. No problem. Or if you're playing in a very specific setting, they might be like, well, you know, I've done a bunch of adventures in Waterdeep, and the last campaign I played in, you know, we spent a lot of time in Waterdeep, so I don't want to go back to Waterdeep. Okay, we won't be in Waterdeep. This also includes safety tool kind of aspects. If somebody has a history with a delicate sort of subject matter, this is where there is also a safe place for them to sort of bring it up. Like, hey, maybe I don't want a lot of visceral violence, or I don't want anything that has something to do with kids and things like that. Like, this is the sort of place that I provide a space for them to bring that up, to make sure everybody's on the same page, so I don't, you know, overstep my bounds, which I definitely have done before, especially as a newer Dungeon Master. and made people uncomfortable, and then have to sort of like walk that stuff back. Be like, oh, nope, that is nuts that I should have done. I did not know people were going to have problems with that. But you live and you learn. And that's the important part, is that you learn from it, right? And change your ways and check in with people and make sure people feel comfortable at the table. Like, even for me, like, one of the things that I would probably have in here for myself if I was a player, I'd be like, oh, well, I don't really want a lot of, like, gratuitous sex stuff in it. Like, that's not really a thing that I'm interested in exploring through the D&D, right? Or any other tabletop RPG. Like, I'm very much a, like, let's fade to black and early on that stuff, rather than, you know, have people sort of like RP it out. And then I have some of my own sort of stuck in things, and these were a specific campaign I was running. It was like, and this is in general, I put less emphasis on filling roles for a balanced party. If you guys all want to play Dwarf Fighters, that's perfectly acceptable. I'll tailor the challenges to that. The idea that nobody should feel like, oh, well, we need a healer in the group, I guess I'll play a cleric. I didn't want to play a cleric, but I'm going to play a cleric. No, you play whatever you want. We'll figure it out. That's where me stepping in is that DMGM can do the heavy lifting on that and be like, okay, they do not have this. I'm going to give them specific items, or I'm going to tune challenges specifically around both enabling them to play that party, but also at appropriate times putting pinches on them so they feel that the pinch of not having that bit of the party, which I think is also very healthy. To be like, oh, well, you're gonna fight a bunch of undead in this one adventure, in this one dungeon. Man, it'd be really nice if you had that cleric. But you guys, nobody decided to play a cleric or paladin, so you're not gonna have turn undead or any of that radiant damage that would really be helpful right now. Other things down here, sentient monsters play smart. I try not to make monsters too dumb. Monsters with animal intelligence kind of act like animals, and monsters with human-esque intelligence act like humans. They have tactics, they gang up on people, they play smart. This comes very much from book series of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, which is, I feel like, very sort of based off of the 4th edition kind of idea, because 4th edition was very big on sort of like the tactical elements of the gameplay, and so when it's coming back into D&D, that was a huge emphasis for me on both sides of the table as a player and a dungeon master, about tactics and knowing the capabilities of monsters and players in combat, how to match monsters and players together to optimize has a sort of a sour taste, but to synergize, I guess. Get ways to work together with your teammate and to make a good situation, which works for monsters too, and 4E is very clear about that in the way that you build encounters and the roles monsters have in 4E, where you have monsters that are supposed to be up in the good guy's face, in the party's face, defending weaker monsters in the back that have that very much sort of glass cannon duality, just like wizards and sorcerers on the player side, where they're casters and guys with bows who don't have a lot of hit points but can do quite a bit of damage. And so those guys stick in the back, they're in cover, they're elevated on like a gallery or a tower where people can't get to them. Sentient monsters play smart. They run, they go and get their friends, they raise alarms, they do all that stuff. I just let people know that beforehand. Is that if you go into a dungeon expecting to kill everybody in one room, move on to the next room, kill everybody in the room, move on to the next room, and not have any repercussions for making a lot of noises by basically trying to genocide your way through a dungeon, you're going to run into that third room that's going to have 4 rooms worth of bad guys in it if you let one of them get away. Which is very similar if you guys follow the Matt Colville D&D channel on YouTube. Very, very similar to what his players call the Matt Colville screw, which is just, you got too deep into the dungeon and you made a bunch of noise and now the bad guys know where you are, and then you tried to rest in the middle of the dungeon, and so then now you gotta fight all the bad guys at one time, sort of idea, which just isn't really a screw. It's just the monsters being mildly rational. And then generally I do average HP on level ups for PCs, and pretty much what I tell most groups that I run for is that, hey, you guys make the choice. Do you guys want to do, if you want to do roll and or take average on the way up, then I'll roll for the monster HP. If you guys want to take max HP, the monsters get max HP. So it just kind of depends on what you want to do. And once I usually frame it like that, most of them are like, yeah, I'd rather roll for it or take average. yeah, that's probably smart. Otherwise, the monsters have a lot more hit points. And then some sort of more background stuff about sort of the world. And this is sort of towards the end of sort of these sort of initial interviews and initial sort of talking with the different players and what they want out of the game. And I made these boilerplated for that specific campaign that was running, so these would change depending on what people want. But this was sort of the world I had in mind to sort of give people an idea of my aspect, my input into the campaign. Because it's not just what the players want, it's also what I want. And I get priority because I'm running the game. So I let them know, you know, in this world that I'm imagining, magic is rare, and it's not well understood. And most magic cannot be ID'd. And I think, I didn't write it down here, but I think I told them in this specific campaign that the identify spell did not exist in this world. Like, you could detect magic, but you couldn't identify magic items. And I think I did that to put the fear of cursed items in there. I don't think I actually added any cursed items in this campaign, but I wanted them to have this feeling that the magic was weird and not really understood. And that kind of goes with the next one. Most people have seen very little magic, and there are a lot of hucksters, hedge mages that use sleight of hand to pretend to do magic, or special effects, fireworks, things like that, to kind of pretend like they're doing magic when they don't really know how to do magic. Point number 3 is there are sort of adventure guilds that kind of serve as famous adventurer fan clubs or bounty contracts, conciliaries. So basically, the idea was in this world is that if you did enough adventuring and got famous enough, you would be famous enough that people would call to ask you for your help, and then those people would show up, be like, yeah, that's great, take out a contract to do something, and then basically sell off that contract to lesser adventurers to take care of. And then they would just collect a percentage of the payout for it. And then I had some questions in here as well where I wasn't sure, and I kind of wanted feedback from the players. Are there any other sort of important groups or individuals, factions that you want to see in the world? You have this idea, it's like, oh, well, I have this idea for a character that kind of comes from a mage academy, so I'd like the mage academy there to be sort of like a wizard academy that's really important in the world, and be like, okay, cool, we can add that. Or very specific individuals that were, you know, based off of things that ideas they have for maybe backstories, bad guys, or things like that they wanted to see. And how common are certain classes and races? Now, obviously, we kind of talked about the Adventurers Guild, but there's a big difference between having that sort of Adventurers Guild where, you know, 1 out of 10 people is a fighter, and then 1 out of 100 people is an adventurer of any type. Just trying to get a gauge on how generally, like, how human-centric the world is. Like, is it like 90% humans? It's like 40% humans, right? Try to figure out like how diverse it is as far as sort of like species / races is. How sort of common are like adventuring classes in the way that the PCs are understood. And then the last one I have on here is a long rest, which I changed to be, for this campaign, 24 hours per tier. So levels 1 through 4, that's 1 day. Levels 5 through 10, that's 2 days. 11 through 16, that's 3 days. 17 plus levels is 4 days. That you have to rest in a safe, secure, comfortable location. And the PCs can't do any sort of like downtime activities during that. Like, that's specifically resting. The idea being that they need an amount of rest that mirrors the difficulty of the challenges they're going up against, right? The idea that there's a big difference between like doing a small fight and doing a massive fight, right? The idea that the recovery periods would be so much longer because the injuries you would sustain from that are going to be so much more severe. And then at the end, this is just a note for myself to make sure that I do a short primer, 1 to 3 pages about the world and the rules. So that way I can give it out to all the players and everybody's on the same page. And then there's sort of like this second area. So I can't remember. I think with this one I did everybody's character. Well, not everybody's, but I think I did most of the people's characters separate. And so everything before that is just sort of like one-off. And I can run through most of this in like 10-15 minutes with each player. So just try to like schedule a Zoom call or something like that and go over it with them, kind of talk it out real quick, and then do another character creation session. I try to do not everybody at the same time, first because it takes a lot more time, and again second, just sort of previously, like I said, it's like I don't want somebody to feel like they're bullied or pressured into playing a certain type of character or having a certain sort of aspect of their character just because it ties in with what the rest of the group is doing. Like, I can take care of that from the DM sort of perspective. So I use the character creation questions. Most of these are from Xanathar's guide, which I'm looking at on my shelf. Kind of starting at the beginning and kind of working our way down, like what sort of race / species do you want to play? Where were you born? And that's sort of the way that I do that is like, were you born where the adventure's going to start? sort of like within the surrounding area, like the same sort of like nation state, or are you some like a foreigner from far away? And then your cast, sometimes I can have them choose it. I can also have the option for them. A lot of these I try to include the option for them to roll it, because I feel like a lot of people kind of come at a campaign and they don't really have necessarily off the bat a really strong idea about what sort of character they want to play. So I allow them to have some random rolls to kind of help them out. Parents, guardians, all this stuff's in Xanathar's Guide to help them sort of roll those up, and it kind of puts them in a position where you don't run into that campaign where every player character is an orphan that doesn't have any family. Like, make sure you have some family and some friends, parents and guardians, siblings, that sort of stuff. The stigma with that comes from primarily bad DMs or GMs. The idea is, like, if I have some sort of vulnerability in my character, if I have some sort of NPC or specific place or item or something like that that's tied to my backstory, that the DM will then exploit it to my detriment. And, you know, I haven't really had that much experience with it from the player side, but it is something I like to include as a DM, to be like, hey, you know, you should... It really helps ground characters in the world when they're related to specific places and people. And so I try to include those things. And I was like, just because you have 4 brothers doesn't mean that I'm going to make you do 4 adventures where those 4 brothers are kidnapped. They may never come up. I mean, if I DM the way I usually DM, like run games the way I usually run, somebody from your backstory is going to show up, but they may not be the person who's in danger. They may be the person who's asking you for help, and they're not necessarily like a liability. They may actually be the patron for a new adventure, or the way that you get into the adventure through a hook, but not necessarily the final goal of the adventure is rescuing that person or whatever. Or that, you know, your sibling's going to turn bad and be the BBEG in the campaign either. And here I had stats we were using. I think it was a standard array. I wasn't having them roll for this one just to make sure everybody was on the same page. Doing the childhood memories, that's from Xanathar's Guide. Coming of age and apprenticeship. So with this one and with a lot of other ones, we'll see this. I feel like the easiest way to sort of like homebrew stuff in 5e, like the very easiest thing to do, is to do custom backgrounds. And so that's sort of what I'm doing here with that sort of coming of age and apprenticeship. Like, where did you do it? You know, what sort of cast, you know, social cast were you in? What sort of training were you doing? All to sort of like put you together with your background. And that training's like academic, criminal, military, performance, political, professional, religious, resources. Kind of be like, you know, were you a student of something? Did you turn into a life of crime? Did you do were you some sort of warrior or soldier or something like that? Did you get into performance where you were doing, you know, acting, playwrights, music, painting, something like that? Were you some sort of political thing? Were you like a junior bureaucrat or a clerk or a secretary or something like that? Professional things, so like work in a very professional sense. So maybe you worked in, I guess everything that kind of falls under professional kind of falls under arts and crafts as well. So it's like, were you part of a guild? Were you sort of like a guild artisan? Do things like that. Have some sort of trade. Trade would be a better name than professional. I should have used trade. Religious, you know, were you some sort of like acolyte? Were you going to seminary school to try to become a priest? Shrine maiden, things like that. And then resources is a very fancy way to say you were some sort of basic laborer. Were you some sort of farmer? Did you work in the mines? A fisher? Something like that. Sailors, anything that's sort of like generally unskilled labor. Not necessarily, like, I mean, sailors kind of skilled labor. You kind of have to know what the heck you're doing to be a sailor. And then, right, going to be like, all right, you get the 2 skills based off of what you talked about, like the location, the level of people, the social cast of people you're working with, and the sort of training you were doing. Pick 2 skills that meet that, and we'll talk about it back and forth to make sure we both agree on that. And then 2 language or tool proficiencies, and then 1 sort of feature that we can kind of go over if you have an idea, or we can start looking through the many features that come from existing backgrounds. Pick one that kind of matches that, with a very minor tweaks would fit. And yeah, to this day, that's generally how I do backgrounds, even for my own PCs. I try to generally make a custom background at this point for most species that I play, just because I feel like it helps a lot. It gives me, it better grounds that character for me, along with having sort of like the family and friends aspect. It makes them feel like they're in the world. It makes them feel like they have this background with a very specific occupation or set of skills or training, etc. Like in one campaign, that character has a background in which they have modified the Outlander background. Give this idea that, you know, I'm playing a young kid, he's like 17 years old, I think. He's kind of he like lives on the edge of society because of what's kind of going on with him and his sort of history, and sort of the character idea is that he's sort of in between sort of like a hill folks, like somebody who lives like outside the norms of society. And so he kind of floats in and out between those sort of groups. So he kind of does things where he's pretty familiar with like barbarian tribes and people like druids, hill folk, pariah people. But also he does spend some time in like pretty normal, mainly smaller settlements like villages and hamlets and things like that. So he's pretty comfortable like going back and forth between those groups. But also he has a bunch of like survival skills for sort of being out on the wilds and is by himself. And so I kind of used the Outlander background and sort of tweaked it a little bit to kind of make it feel a little bit more like him. It would make sense for a person that kind of lived that life. More Xanathar's Guide, the age-appropriate life events is really fun. I've used these in a current campaign where we're getting close to wrapping up, and some of that stuff's finally starting to play out. We actually had a couple of the NPCs from that character's background finally show up. Sort of. Not their actual NPCs, but manifestations of those NPCs actually show up, which is really interesting. And a lot of fun to finally see them. I mean, we've been playing those characters for a year and a half plus now, and finally saw sort of like these background elements get sort of like tied in towards the end, which was a lot of fun. Other families, significant others, I played a character that had an off-screen wife that he was slowly becoming more and more estranged from as he was... the more he spent doing adventuring, the more he was bitten by the wanderlust sort of bug, and he was like, I'm not sure I want to go home, and like, I love my wife, but also like this is a totally different lifestyle I've never had before, and I'm really interested in it. So that was a fun character to play. So it's kind of fun to have those other sort of significant others, children's, especially as you get older, right? You'll want more variety in the age and connection between your character and other potential NPCs. Obviously, you're going to choose your class. And then these last questions, I think, are primarily from Guy over How to Be a Great GM. I think that's where most of these came from. Which are just sort of good questions to sort of round out the character creation. Try to figure out who this character is in a very sort of succinct fashion. Try to get to the kernel of who they are. So, why did you leave everything behind to become an adventurer? And generally, I frame that as you are running after something. You have some goal you're trying to achieve. You're trying to accomplish something, or you're running away from something. Like something is there's something in your past or something you're trying to leave behind by becoming an adventurer and starting this. Next one is, what's one thing that seems to constantly get you in trouble? Be some sort of quirk, a flaw, a personality trait, right? Maybe you're like, well, I can't see, like I really hate seeing like meek people being bullied or something like that. So you'll always stand up for the little guy, right? That can be a quirk that always gets you in trouble. And these are things, a lot of people have bad experience. A lot of players have bad experiences where DMs sort of overuse this stuff and it's like, oh, well, if you give me something to pull on, I'm going to completely unravel the entire sweater. But instead of being like, hey, I want to put your character in a position to play on that thing, not necessarily because it's totally a detriment to you, but maybe gives you an easy hook into a specific adventure and things like that. Not necessarily to penalize you for having people and things. As a DM, I don't want to penalize you for having a backstory. I want you to have a backstory, so that way we can meld it into the overall story, so you don't feel like your character doesn't feel like they're a replaceable part within that story. Like, they feel like they belong in the world and they're attached to the story that's going on. What are your long-term goals, right? I feel like every good player character has something they're trying to do that's not tied to the adventure as we know it. So, like I said, I have this one character that sort of lives on with like one foot in each world, one in the civilized world, one in the uncivilized sort of world. And so he's just kind of looking for a place where he belongs, right? He's trying to find a place for himself. And he's had sort of poor experiences on both sides, and that's why he's kind of stuck in the middle. So his long-term goal is to try to find a place where he can be at peace, even though, he's a 17-year-old kid and he doesn't really know what that would look like. And he doesn't really understand people in the world and how it works yet. Another one that's really important, like, how do you relax? When your player character has downtime, what do they do? Or if they've had a really stressful day, what do they do to sort of, like, chill out and relax? And it makes me think of, like, whenever I read this question, the thing that jumps to my mind, the player character that jumps to my mind, my PC, is I played a Starfinder character. In Starfinder, you have, like, sort of a vocation, and that can be like a professional skill, and that can be one of your skills you have in there. And his was sort of like horticulture or gardening or whatever it is. And so his sort of background is that, well, he's got his entire sort of like room in the ship is like a giant greenhouse. Like, it's always like really humid and warm in there, and it's really kind of gross. But that's where he's spending most of his time, is that he's, taking care of his plants and making clippings from them and drying things out, for spices and herbs and medicines and all sorts of stuff. So he had like this whole sort of side thing, so much that the way that I talked about his room on the ship is that he basically turned his entire room on the ship into sort of like a vertical garden. So he had walls and grow lights and all that stuff, and he basically slept in the closet of his room on a mattress, on a real thin like futon style mattress, so that way he could spend more of his room space was dedicated to the plants. So there was always something for him to do, right? He always had something. Whenever we reached a new port, a new star station, right, something like that, he'd always be like, well, is there some place I can get new plants or sell my plants or talk to somebody, figure out what's going on with that, which made it a very easy in for anything. There was always a reason for him to be doing something, which is really helpful. And when he was upset with people, I knew where he would go, right? And I knew what he would do. And the last one I have down here is, do you know someone in the party? And if so, what's your relationship? I think it would be really helpful to create those bonds with people within the party. So not everybody in the party knows each other, but everybody in the party knows like at least one or two other people in the party. You're sort of a group of acquaintances who kind of know each other, but not really, which is really helpful, I think, for getting a campaign off the ground. And I don't think you should necessarily have to force that with it. It's kind of what I put in here, is that usually I would talk to somebody, one or two people, be like, hey, do you want to know somebody in the party, and if this was not the first person I was talking to, be like, well, this character does this and this, and do you think maybe you would have a connection with that character? Oh, maybe, yeah, I think maybe this and this, and it's like, okay. And then I, chat up the other person and be like, hey, they're interested in maybe having a relationship. Do you think like your character would maybe have this relationship with a character like this? And if so, then we connect those dots, and right now you can show up and immediately, right when you start the game, you have PCs that can interact with each other. They already have like a through line, and they can talk about one or two or three specific subjects about things. That doesn't have to do anything that isn't dependent on things that are happening in the game, in the world, plot-wise. And down here I had some more campaign planning stuff. So I kind of had, alright, I knew for this campaign I wanted to try to cap out at level 7 for the PCs. So I kind of broke that down to be somewhere between 12 to 18 4-hour sessions. And important locations, so I knew like in my world I was going to be using a location that I developed called Port Grace. And I knew I was going to be using that as sort of one of the more important sort of like kickoff locations for everything. And then I just I took the notes that I made between talking to everybody and put them into this session. So we have 3 different PCs. So I only got to talk to 3 of them before we started the game. So we had sort of like these people, and then these people had, these players had things in common with each other, things this player's interested in, things this player's interested in. Just sort of bullet points to remind myself about what they're looking for and what they're not looking for in the game. And some of this is said stuff, some of this is stuff I just picked up my own personal notes after talking with them. Like Jeff was going to prefer combat over story, very sort of like classic Slayer, beer and pretzels kind of kick down the door slate, monsters kind of guy. And he wants to make sure that we have at least one combat per session. He also gets frustrated when the group has analysis paralysis, which means that he does not do well with things like puzzles where people have to sit and think about stuff. So I want to make sure that I don't have too many of those sort of problems in there. But I can also rely on him make the jump. Like he'll just choose a direction to go. And he doesn't like not having an impact on the story. Right? He wants to feel like he is driver in the story. Jeff and Anna, neither of them, both of them came from the 4E. This was a 5E game, they came from 4E. So they didn't really enjoy the theater of the mind combat, so making sure that there's some sort of tactical aspects to combat. This ended up kind of being a problem in that campaign because 5e is just not really built for that. Right? As far as really minutia tactical combat, there's just not a lot for that in 5e. They wanted me to continue to use sort of like MMO 4e terms, so it kept to their 4e experience. So using things like flanking and takes and DPS and that sort of stuff. Stuff that I generally don't... I put this note because that's generally stuff that I don't try to use when running the game, because I want to differentiate it from that. That sort of mechanical, very dry, video game-esque sort of information. So I knew Anna wasn't interested in playing a tank or one-shots. So she wanted adventures that were going to last multiple sessions. She didn't want one-and-done adventures, which is fine. It was sort of a weird take. I don't think I've come across anybody else who was just like, I don't want to run one-shots. Like, I understand not wanting to run an entire campaign full of one-shots, right? Because that can feel really unrelated. But, and like I said, this is like 2 years ago. So maybe that's what she meant. I can't remember off the top of my head, or maybe that I just wrote it down poorly. But I would assume that was more what she meant than she didn't like specifically one-shots. She just didn't want to run a series of unrelated adventures together. Not a fan of excessive vulgarity. That was one of the things that she didn't want in the game, right? She didn't want a lot of cursing. And I was like, that's fine. I'm not a big cursor anyway, so... and she told me that she's not great at staying focused. She has ADD issues. And it's like, that's fine, you know, you do what you need to do. I mean, at this point, you just play with people who have some other issues. Have some issues staying concentrated. And I get it, right? It's not like there's not a lot of stimulation sometimes in D&D, especially when you're waiting for other people to do their things and you can kind of get sidetracked. That was just her letting me know, just offhand. And I think it was Anna who told me that she was doing things like knitting or crocheting during the game. And I was like, that's fine. If that helps you pay attention, then do it. As long as you're not playing around on the computer, that's usually not going to bother me. If you just need something in your hands to keep you busy, to keep you focused, I'd rather you be doing something tactile rather than surfing on your phone and not paying attention. Kevin wanted unaffiliated adventures. He wanted a variety of characters, so he didn't want to feel like he was running one long adventure. He wanted to feel like there were different adventures in different places with different NPCs and different plot threads. So, this is why we do this, so to find sort of that balance between where Kevin's going to be able to have those multiple adventures, but also not so far where Anna's feels like we're doing a whole bunch of unrelated things, like one series of one-shot after one-shot after one-shot. Finding that sort of middle ground where most people are going to be happy. And prefer plot-driven opportunity to engage in the story, so we could tie this directly in. Opportunity to engage in the story ties directly into Jeff wanting to make sure that he has an impact in the story. The difference is that Kevin wanted a very heavy sort of plot-driven thing, and Jeff wants a more combat-over story. So he wants more actionable content, where Kevin kind of wanted more plot, wanted a little bit more, a little meatier plot. So being able to sort of figure out what the balance of that's going to be. Like sometimes we'll lean more heavily on the plot and things that are going on, and then we'll have to pull back and do some combat at some point. We're just trying to find homeostasis. We're just trying to find balance between everything. So everybody feels like they're kind of getting what they want out of the game. And that Kevin liked stealthy characters, which I knew already going in, because I had already played with him before. And then down here we have some PC ads. Like I was like, oh, here are some things that I want to make sure that I gave them some choices for items. Like they could choose some items. And then I was going to have some rare items I was going to give them. And then down here we have sort of like who their characters were. Just sort of a tie-in as to what their characters were. Most importantly, I have down here, I made sure to get their sort of player archetypes, because I thought that would also be helpful, as well as keeping track of what magic items they had. So I knew that Kevin was going to be, storyteller, thinker, explorer. Jeff was going to be a power gamer, a slayer, a thinker who wanted to think out problems, who wanted to be actionable, wanted to do things, to kill things, get loot. This is the person I didn't meet with. beforehand. And then we have down here Anna, who was an actor, a slayer, and a watcher. So she wanted to take part in things, but also was, when it came down to combat, wanted to be very sort of tactical, wanted to like tunnel vision on combat, but when it was outside of that, also wanted to really inhabit her character, wanted to do quite a bit of RP, but she also had a tendency, she was definitely the person who sort of came into the group who had, I'd say that sort of watcher mentality, which is not pejorative, but least interested in D&D for D&D aspect. Or if you're unfamiliar with the watcher archetype as far as players in D&D and other TTRPGs kind of go, the idea is that they just kind of soak in the experience. These tend to be the type of players that would be just as happy playing Monopoly or some other sort of board or card game as they are playing D&D. Like, they're more here for the group and spending time with people, and less so necessarily the actual game. It's the action of playing the game rather than the game itself that's important to them, which was kind of interesting to see that sort of juxtaposed with the actor sensibility and the slayer sensibility, because usually these three archetypes usually don't go together, and so it was very interesting to watch some of these sort of slide in and out of each of those. When combat happened, she was very much in slayer realm. When she had the spotlight, she'd definitely jump into the actor role, and then when she was out of the spotlight and we weren't in combat, primarily exploration, right? The exploration tier is where she kind of took the backseat and kind of became the watcher. Jeff, pretty standard, what I'd say 3E, 4E kind of player, power gamer, slayer, primarily. Thinker, problem solver kind of person, so is a person that primarily is interested in the combat aspect of the game, and then a little bit in the exploration, but not particularly interested in the RP social aspect. And on Kevin's side, you see, storyteller, thinker, and explorer, which means that they're very interested. That storyteller and explorer kind of go together, where they're very interested in learning about the world and the lore of the world, which is both RP and exploration together. And then thinker tends to be a very problem solver, so very big focus on the exploration pillar, and less so on both the combat and social pillars. Though I'd probably say I remember him being pretty engaged in the social side, so I'd say combat was probably the one aspect he was probably the least interested in. He's probably more interested in the sort of the storyteller and thinker and exploration aspect, and not so much the combat aspect. So I don't think that nearly did as much for him as the other two pillars did. But yeah, I mean, that kind of drops it. That's kind of everything. Hopefully that's useful for you guys to kind of see how I've done session zeros or even session 0.5s, and that's usually, I've talked about this in the blog before, reddragonfiend.com, you can go read it. Talk about doing session 0.5. In that sort of 0.5 session idea is that I would do the sort of individual aspects kind of before. So sort of this first half here. I do that all, like I said, try to do it in individual sessions or in doubles if necessary, with multiple people at the same time if I absolutely need to, but I try to do them individually. And then I would do this character creation. Everybody would do them all together. Well, it would be session 1. So everybody's going to sit down and make characters together, and we're going to get through that, and then what I call session 0.5 is that then I'm going to run them through maybe 1 or 2 encounters, just so every time that everybody kind of comes together for that first game, we're actually already off and running. So it's not that everybody got together and then we have to wait another week to get everybody together again with the same new characters everybody's still trying to learn and then try to play. It's like, no, you're going to make your character and then we're going to get through, I say at least 1 encounter, but, try to get them hooked into that first adventure, right? Get them hooked into that first adventure and off to the races. So that way they're excited to come back to the table to play and everybody knows where we're picking up from that next real first session of the game. And that's pretty much all I had to talk about. And I think we're gonna hit this back. We're gonna come back, do the solo RPG series. We have a big fight with a black dragon coming up, so stick around for that. Could go very poorly. Not really sure. We're not in the greatest position. Might have to run from this fight. Not really sure. Of course, we have the blog reddragonfiend.com. You want to catch up on the solo RPG series and see other content like this? Follow me on Twitter, Ko-fi, ko-fi.com if you want to donate, help support the channel, or pick up things over on DriveThruRPG where we have some pay what you want downloads. Check all that out. I think that's it. I hope you guys had fun. Enjoy some of this and me talking about video games which is something new. Haven't really done that before. And also talking about D&D stuff, which I have done before. And I'll see you guys next time. Alright? Bye.